Have you ever sat back and thought, why do game developers spend years on a game fully aware that it's not very good? I certainly have, to the point I've lost all my friends from constantly bringing it up in conversations, and I'm currently on medication for it. I mean, obviously there's a number of legitimate reasons why. A rushed schedule, incompetent management, or they're simply employed by Ubisoft. But every now and then, these developers make their game awful entirely on purpose. And you wouldn't believe some of the despicable reasons why. So this episode, we take a look at these gimped games, these crippled computer programs, and these nerfed Nintendos that were so underhanded, you've less chance of being scammed out of your money putting it into a Peter Molyneux Kickstarter. But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I'll welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 games purposely made terrible by dickish developers. We'll start today's episode off with one of the first ever recorded documents of a purposely gimped game, the Atari 2600 and Intellivision ports of Donkey Kong. Now, at its time of release, Donkey Kong was one of the hottest arcade games around. Arcades were seeing queues out into the street to play the copyright infringing adventures of an Italian woman kidnapping King Kong, to the point Nintendo themselves could barely make enough machines to keep up with the demand. No changes there then. So the hype for a home port of the game was beyond boiling point. And with Nintendo having no interest in home gaming themselves at the time, this honour had been awarded to Coleco, who had the foresight and good fortune to grab the rights before it hit arcades. Donkey Kong's mass popularity was Coleco striking gold. Their own console, the ColecoVision, was in 3rd place in a console race and needed a killer app to take on their rivals. So while they could have cashed in on making Donkey Kong a console exclusive, one bright spark at the company had an even sneakier idea. Why not make even more money by releasing it first only as a bundle with the ColecoVision, so even if you already owned a Coleco, you'd need to buy another console just to grab it? Then anyone who was still umming and ahhing about buying it, release it on their rival consoles 6 months later, but purposely make them crap, fooling the owners into assuming their consoles are inferior, thus enticing them even further into believing that if they want the true Donkey Kong experience, they need to buy a ColecoVision. It sounds absolutely scummy, doesn't it? But true to their word, the rival ports were completely dire. For instance, the 2600 port makes Donkey Kong look like a depressed gingerbread man who throws cookies at you while guarding Lisa Simpson. And the Intellivision version manages to look even worse, with a giant booger lobbing cheese wheels at you instead. And if making the graphics look terrible wasn't bad enough, they only ported 2 levels of the arcade game to each system. The first level, and that one with the weird ghost things. Then, the icing on this crappy cake, they refused to make an Atari 5200 port of the game due to it having similar components to the ColecoVision, and knowing full damn well they'd be called out on this scam if they did. And you want to hear the most shocking thing of all? Coleco totally got away with it too! After release, Coleco managed to sell a whopping 6 million copies of the game across all systems. An unprecedented number at the time, and pretty impressive even by today's standards. Their sales doubled to $500 million, and their earnings quadrupled to $40 million. Of course, over the intervening decades, talented programmers have proven both the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision were both more than capable of making pretty decent ports of Donkey Kong with their homebrew ports. But you got to give Coleco credit for such a devious way to make their console look superior. Bastards. Ubisoft's seminal murder people using traffic lights with your iPhone simulator, and winner of most famous gimped game, Watch Dogs, always had a rocky development cycle. Originally devised as a sequel to Driver San Francisco before being converted into an all-new IP, Watch Dogs was the first game to be previewed for unannounced next-gen consoles at the 2012 E3. But its first bout of ever-growing bad publicity began 2 years later, when not only was the game already 5 years into development announced it would be delayed for a further 6 months, but the released gameplay footage didn't look anywhere near as impressive as its initial showing. This was quite perplexing to PC owners, since Ubisoft had been hyping their close collaboration with Nvidia to make the game as visually stunning as possible. So how could it look notably worse if it was specifically designed to work for top level graphics cards? But upon release in May 2014, things went from bad to worse, as the PC version was locked to a 30 frames per second frame rate, when it could easily do double that. But sparks really began to fly when a fan looked into the game's code and discovered textures that make the game far more impressive, to the point it looked just like that 2012 preview all those years ago. So why on earth did Ubisoft purposely make Watch Dogs so terrible? What on earth is going on here? Well, this time it all boils down to good old money. As popular as PC gaming is, it pales into comparison with the success of console gaming. Console games are not only far more popular, they more importantly retail for at least a third more than their PC counterparts. And on top of that, Watch Dogs was being released on 5 different consoles. So to put consumers off thinking they were buying an inferior product would be financial suicide. So the PC port had to be throttled to appear in line with the console ports. So yeah, it's essentially a total opposite of Coleco's plan. It's not just a financial risk in this situation either. There's also the fear of angering both Sony and Microsoft by showing their brand new consoles were obsolete right out of the bag. So being out of favour of the top 2 console manufacturers would also spell doom for your business. In hindsight, the PS4 and Xbox One ports probably were going to use the nicer graphics initially. Ubisoft were quite likely unaware of their specific capabilities in 2012, and the final retail models simply couldn't handle what they had originally programmed. However, there's also the question of why Ubisoft left the texture pack in the PC version's code still. Was it incompetence? Or a frustrated employee not wanting years of hard work going to waste? But the only thing we do all know is they replace all the decent characters with annoying hipsters for the sequel. Then referenced a ton of crappy internet memes to hide a rather shallow story. So probably no Watch Dogs 3 anytime soon then. Long before ISIS made decapitations popular, the cult 80s movie Highlander was doing it long before, infusing this barbaric ritual into an ageless tale of Americans pretending to be Scottish and Scotsmen pretending to be Spaniards. But as with a lot of other 80s movie licenses, Connor McLeod's adventures in head dismemberment and infertility proved too much of a temptation for old Mercurian chums at Ocean, who quickly snapped up the rights for the 8-bit home computers. Now, picking up licenses back in the 80s usually revolved around paying the licensee a small upfront fee. Then the rest would be paid in percentage of the royalties. Unfortunately, Ocean's contract negotiator was a bit dippy the day they signed, as it dawned on the company that if Highlander proved popular, the insane amount of royalties that they had agreed to would literally bankrupt them. But what to do? They can't bail as they're contractually obliged to make the game still. So how can they sell a game but make sure no one buys it? By making the game as crap as possible. Yep, the sole reason Highlander is a terrible game is because Ocean didn't want anyone to buy it. It does sound completely stupid, but it did actually work for them. Purposely slowing down the game to a frustrating crawl and making the controls unresponsive meant everyone hated it. And with magazines like Zap64 rating it a lowly 30%, Highlander never entered the top 20 charts, thus ultimately Ocean dodging a bullet. Sadly, the same can't be said about the Highlander movie sequels. Those were rubbish, down to good old incompetence. T.S. Eliot once wrote, "This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper." While it may be considered rather vague and pretentious, it makes for a fitting epitaph for Atari, for not only their final console, that Atari Box doesn't count, but also their final ever game, Fight for Life. Now, the Atari Jaguar was released during that awkward mid-phase of a console generation's life cycle. So, while it was easy to humiliate 16-bit consoles with their alleged superior 64-bit power, taking on the upcoming Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn Next Generation systems was a whole new ballgame. They needed something impressive to compete with them, something of a killer app, and that game was to be Fight for Life. Fight for Life was a 3D one-on-one fighting game created by Francois Bertrand. You may not know the name, but he was responsible for the development of Sega's classic Virtua Fighter. Atari had headhunted him upon finishing his work and offered him vast amounts of money, staff and resources if he could do the same magic for Atari as he did for Sega. Though while Bertrand took them up on the offer, Atari didn't exactly keep to their side of the bargain. He was forever being fobbed off with excuses, delayed payments, and his deadline pushed further and further forward. Francois was forced to not only be director, but also the designer and only programmer on the game, frustrating the poor guy even more. Atari's competence wasn't exactly helping either. Their PR staff was so excited about this PlayStation killer, they were offering gaming magazines review copies less than a few months into development. So, with magazines assuming this was the final product and not just an extremely early preview, Atari were hounded in magazines with negative press, making them angry and demanding Bertrand revamp the entire game. An entire game that had only just begun development. But the final straw began when Atari's paychecks stopped arriving. So, come the December of 1995, Atari owing Bertrand 4 months of pay and the game's deadline approaching that month, Bertrand thought, screw this, and sent Atari an unfinished build of the game. He kept his side of the deal, but also kept the final completed build of the game and wouldn't release it until Atari paid him what they owed. But Atari didn't care that it wasn't the final build, nor that it was a slow, terrible mess. They had something playable to sell, so released it in its unfinished, buggy glory. So, the sole reason Fight for Life is terrible is because Atari didn't want to pay the developer what he was owed and called his bluff by releasing an unfinished product. With dwindling sales, a drought of upcoming games, and ultimately Sam Tramiel's infamous interview for Next Generation magazine, where he boasted that the Jaguar was just as, if not more powerful than the Sega Saturn, threatening to sue Sony if they released the PlayStation 2 for $299, which Sony did, and that the Jaguar 2 was already in development, which it wasn't, made him the laughingstock of the entire gaming industry. Atari shut up shop with the Jaguar less than a year later, with Fight for Life being its final ever commercially released title. Francois Bertrand left Atari and went to work for Activision, developing several PS1 titles, but was kind enough to release the actual final build of Fight for Life online a few years later. So, thus lies the end of Atari. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. If you want a game that's been ruined from corporate pissing matches and marketing completely destroying creativity for the sake of their egotistical image, one needs to look no further than Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. When Capcom first started collaborating with Marvel on fighting games way back in 1994 with X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel was a very different operation. A comic book company on the verge of bankruptcy, who were more than happy to let Capcom take the reins, which is clearly evident by the obscure characters appearing like the Silver Samurai to appeal to their Japanese audience. However, since their acquisition by Disney in 2009, Marvel has severely pulled back creative control and let their marketing team have final say. You can see early cracks of this in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and the inclusion of Taskmaster in lieu of the Fantastic Four. Capcom tried to spin it that it was to save money and character slots, but it was later revealed that Disney denied them permission. This was all down to Disney's very public war with Fox over them obtaining perpetual movie rights to the Fantastic Four, when Marvel was in desperate need of money and are now refusing to relinquish them, though strangely Doctor Doom still appears. This war with Fox has now escalated to Disney cancelling the comic, all merchandise, and even refusing to allow their artists to draw Fantastic Four characters at conventions. All this to avoid giving Fox any free publicity. Now, come Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, not only are the Fantastic Four once again absent, but now also Deadpool and the entire roster of X-Men characters. As guess who owes the movie rights to them? This is especially heartbreaking for MVC fans, as Wolverine has been a staple of the Marvel-Capcom collaboration since Mutant Apocalypse on the Super Nintendo. However, in their place are Disney-friendly movie-owned characters, such as the Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy. So while good news for movie fans, especially as there's been a distinct lack of games this generation for them, it's quite a slap in the face for people who grew up with the series. Now, before you all ask, those ugly Capcom characters, were they purposely nerfed at Disney's request to make their characters look superior, as told by the ex-employee whistleblower on Reddit? Well, as much as it would be a great way to end this episode, the answer is a resounding no. As evident by the fact the recent update made them all look far more on model. So that piece of drama was all simply down to Capcom hiring crap artists. Thanks, Capcom. Crapcom. Hello you. Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Ta-ra for now.